on the table, the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
I ask to speak as if we're in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to applaud the confirmation of Judge Gina Groh to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of West Virginia. As then Governor of West Virginia, I was honored to have the first female from the Eastern Panhandle with the highest of credentials, Judge Gro, brought to my attention. I was so proud to appoint her to the 23rd Judicial District in 2006, and she has served with great distinction ever since. I'm also very pleased that my colleague and friend, Senator Jay Rockefeller, saw the same qualities in Judge Gro that I did and recommended her for this prestigious position on the federal bench. I thank him for his steadfast support for her nomination. I just want to take this opportunity to reiterate some of Judge Gina Groh's fine qualities and the reasons I know she will be an exceptional judge on the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of West Virginia. Judge Groh is a well-respected and recognized member of her community in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, as I have known her for many years. In addition, to being the first female circuit judge to serve in the Eastern Panhandle, Judge Groh is only the third female circuit judge to be selected in all of West Virginia. Prior to her circuit court appointment, Judge Groh served as assistant prosecuting attorney at the prosecuting attorney's offices in Berkeley County and Jefferson County, West Virginia. During her 8 years as prosecutor, she established a strong record of protecting her fellow West Virginians by tirelessly pursuing convictions for such crimes as murder, robbery, rape, child abuse, drunk driving, and drug-related offenses. Judge Groh has not only excelled professionally, but has also risen to become a true pillar of her community in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. She dedicates her time to countless charitable foundations and serves on a number of boards. For many years, she has worked for such programs as Robes to School and the Meals with Love Ministry, and has been very involved with her alma mater, Shepherd University, serving both with the Wellness Center and as a member of the Alumni Board. Groh graduated cum laude from Shepherd University in 1986 with a Bachelor of Science degree. She earned the university's highest academic honor as a McMurrin Scholar. In addition to serving as editor-in-chief of the newspaper and vice president of her graduating class, Judge Groh went on to earn her J.D. from West Virginia University's College of Law in Morgantown, West Virginia. I believe that Judge Groh's experience, intellect, leadership, impartiality, and deep roots in the community make her a prudent choice for the vacancy in the Northern District of West Virginia. She exemplifies not only the qualities of a talented jurist, but also the high moral character and sense of justice necessary to make a great judge. I know that it has been exasperating for Judge Groh and her family, waiting for this confirmation, knowing that she came out of the Senate Judiciary Committee without any opposition. And it has been very difficult that we as a body have gotten to the point of slowing down these nominations. And I believe very strongly that our system needs to be changed so that we can get quality judges such as Judge Gina Groh on the bench as quickly as possible so they can work to protect the people of the United States. Mr. President, again, I thank my colleagues for confirming an exemplary candidate for the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of West Virginia, Judge Gina Groh. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the House of Representatives has just passed H.R. 3606, which is styled as a capital formation bill, but it is fundamentally flawed. As more and more people have looked closely at the bill, they have found more and more problems. Problems that could roll back key consumer protections and cause entire financial transactions and financial entities to go dark. One of the fundamental misconceptions in this bill is that you can have robust capital formation without good investor protections. My view is you can't have one without the other, that the strength of our market is the reliance that investors have that they will have the right information, they will know enough about the entity they're investing in to make judicious, sound economic judgments. This proposition would roll back many of those investor protections, would deny them critical information that is essential to make sound judgments, and would ultimately not lead to the supposed goal of the bill, providing more access to capital, particularly for small emerging companies. Serious concerns have been raised about the Cantor bill by current and former regulators in the last 2 weeks. Mary Shapiro, the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the North American Securities Administrators Association, Arthur Levitt, former chairman of the SEC, the head of the American Amex, Lynn Turner, former chief economist of the SEC. Some of the largest pension plans in the entire country have been weighing in through the Council of Institutional Investors. And these are the entities most people want to have invest in their companies as long-term investors. They have real concerns about the House action. We've been getting phone calls and letters from a variety of consumer groups such as the AARP, the Consumer Federation of America, the AFL-CIO, and SAFER, the Economist Committee for Stable, Accountable, Fair, and Efficient Financial Reform. Academic experts like Professor John Coffey of Columbia University School of Law, for one, have called the Cantor bill the, quote, Boiler Room Preservation Act, close quote, because it will mean more pump-and-dump schemes where people are being pressured to invest in highly risky firms and products. Two other noted securities experts from Harvard University Law School and Business School, respectively, John Coates and Robert Posen, have said the bill does more than, in their words, trim regulatory fat, parts of it cut into muscle. We need to slow down this process and get it right. H.R. 3606 can be improved and should be improved. That is why I, together with colleagues, Senators Mary Landrieu and Carl Levin, Sherrod Brown, Jeff Merkley, Senator Dannakakis, my colleague from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator Franken, Senator Harkin, Senator Durbin, and others are introducing a substitute amendment to this bill today. We hope that our legislation can serve as a base bill for the Senate to discuss and amend as we move forward. So what are some of the most serious faults that we are trying to address in the Cantor bill? First and foremost, this bill is unlikely to create jobs, despite the title that the House has bestowed upon it. In fact, it may actually have the opposite effect. By weakening investor confidence, it could actually decrease the number of IPOs and lead to fewer investments in our capital markets. Currently, our markets are considered the most transparent and liquid in the world, which have been one of its great strengths. The confidence that when an investor puts money into an American financial product, an American market, he or she has detailed information about the current status and the prospects of that investment. Under the Cantor bill, our markets will become less transparent, more opaque. Fewer protections will be provided to investors. This could actually lead to fewer investors investing in the United States, since we are in an increasing competition in our global economy with capital markets in London, Paris, Hong Kong, and Singapore, to name just a few. Again, one of the great hallmarks of our markets, starting in 1933 with the securities legislation of the New Deal, was the feeling that investors would be protected, that there would be standards in place, information would be made available to them, and they could have confidence, as much confidence as they could get, in their investments. And when you undermine that confidence, eventually you will undermine both their appetite and capacity to invest. The Cantor bill has more problems. It tries to create a way that crowdfunding can be used to raise money for small enterprises, but it does this with very few protections for investors and would allow unregulated websites to peddle stock to ordinary investors without any meaningful oversight or liability. Crowdfunding is a very interesting new approach to raising capital. Our colleagues, Senator Merkley and Senator Bennett, have spent a lot of time developing very positive legislation which balances the access to capital by tapping into social networks and small investors, but at the same time giving those investors adequate protections. The House has not taken this approach. They have legislation that could indeed create a situation where crowdfunding is plagued by fraud, by manipulation, by people who simply want to make a quick buck, move on, hoping that they will just disappear into the Internet. Now, the Craigslist or eBay model may work to enable people to sell unwanted clothing, bikes, and other goods, but it certainly doesn't work for financial security that requires a much more careful analysis than simply kicking the tires. People with more credit card debt than savings will be tempted with these mass-marketed get-rich schemes to put their money, which they can't afford in many cases, into these schemes. As the economy continues to grow, stocks will rise. We've seen some interesting and very positive developments on Wall Street over the last several weeks, but this ride up could be accompanied by bubbles in these types of crowdfunding schemes where people are putting money in for a quick return based on perhaps the success of one or two companies, but not having the information, not having the appropriate controls on the intermediaries so that they can make a sound, valid investment. There's another aspect of the House legislation in addition to this crowdfunding approach. It's the House IPO on-ramp aspects. This approach, an IPO, of course, is initial public offering. This approach to try to streamline access to the public markets for emerging companies has great merit. But once again, what has happened in the House bill is that they've done this at the expense of necessary protections for investors. Relaxing standards for very large new public companies when no effort supports that idea that those standards stand in the way of these IPOs, and much evidence suggests that the standards prevent serious accounting problems, is not the way to go. The basic essence of their approach, this on-ramp approach, is very large companies with up to $1 billion in revenue can, for a period of 5 years or so, avoid some of the now standard requirements for public companies. This is not an approach for small companies. Companies with $1 billion in revenue are substantial economic enterprises. And the protections that have been put in place over the years, not only to protect the investors, but also to ensure the appropriate audit procedures that are in place to ensure appropriate managerial behavior, for a company of that size, should not be indefinitely waived or waived for a period of 5 years. We could go back, literally roll the clock back, pre-Enron, pre-WorldCom, where because of a creative accounting, because of the lack of adequate audit procedures within the company, real abuses. And the result was Enron collapsed. Their shareholders were left with virtually nothing. And one of the more tragic ironies is that many of their shareholders were their employees who had all of their pensions invested in the company, particularly the case with Enron. Ultimately, the pain to these people caused by lack of good standards, which have been put in place since then, was significant. And if we proceed on this path, might once again have a situation where we're repeating history, and a history we've seen already. Now again, as the economy rebounds, as stocks rise, I think there'll be an invariable increase in new initial public offerings, IPOs. If you look at the data, the numbers of IPOs go up and down, but the most significant factor is simply economic activity. As economic activity goes up, new companies have opportunities, IPOs go up. In this boom, there could be the temptation for these companies, given these new, very relaxed standards, to ignore the problems because they don't have to disclose them adequately. or to deliberately mislead investors because there's no real check on what's being said. The relaxed standards in the House bill could allow companies to engage in deception, to raise and waste more investment money more quickly. There is a way, I think, that we can dial back this excessive legislation in a way that will provide capital formation, but will also provide protections to investors. And I hope we can proceed in that path. Now, increasing IPOs is a valuable goal, but it should be done much more cautiously in my regard, with reforms focused on much smaller companies than those with $1 billion in annual revenues, as is indicated in the House bill. Now, during the course of 3 hearings in the Senate Banking Committee on these issues, it became even clearer that there are problems with the way shareholders are being counted. And this is another aspect of the House bill. They have indicated that they would like to move beyond a number, 500, which requires a company to register under the 1934 Securities Exchange Act with the SEC. This trigger is something that should be considered in terms of present-day standards. The House bill raises this trigger point to 2,000 very quickly without dealing with the so-called beneficial owners problem. If the provision in the House bill was enforced in the past, 2/3 of current public companies would not have been required to register under the 34 Act. Let me say that again. If you reach a certain number of shareholders, you're required to begin to register and begin to give those shareholders required information on a quarterly basis. You're required to file other forms. You're required to be subject to other rules and regulations of the SEC. If this House standard was in place, 2/3 of current public companies would not have to register with the 34 Act. They would be operating in the dark. They would be operating with whatever minimal information they might be required to divulge to their shareholders under state corporate law or, in some cases, state securities laws. That is an astounding number of companies. Most investors take for granted that when you reach a critical size, number of shareholders, et cetera, that you'll begin to report. And again, these reports are the lifeblood, if you will, of the investing community, because they rely upon them for their information about what's going on in the company. They rely upon them for the standards that that company has to follow. Over time, most investors, as a result of registration of the 34 Act, are entitled to receive regular disclosures. And again, these provisions, raising up the level to 2,000 owners, would undermine the goal, which is essentially making companies easier to go public, easier to disclose information. In fact, someone described this as sort of a bipolar piece of legislation. On one hand, they want to relax the standards to get public, and on the other hand, they want to relax the standards to get private. I think we have to be careful in each instance to ensure that investors are protected as well as capital formation is enhanced. The House would also allow companies to, the House bill rather, would also allow companies to advertise risky, less regulated, unregistered private offerings to the general public using, for example, billboards along the highway, cold calls to senior living centers, or other mass marketing methods. It'll tear down protections that were put in place after the late 1990s Internet stock bubble burst that prevented conflicts of interest from tainting the quality of research about companies. What we found in the wake of the dot-com bubble, with many protections in place that would be taken out by this legislation, that there were analysts who were touting companies at the same time other parts of their business were trying to sell those companies' shares. And this conflict of interest between someone who you hope is given an objective opinion would be encouraged, not discouraged, under the House bill. The Canada bill would allow extremely large corporations to avoid SEC oversight. It would allow banks with even hundreds of billions of dollars in assets to deregister and stop being subject to SEC oversight and critical investor protections. And finally, the candidate bill actually doesn't include provisions that are more likely to create jobs for Americans. For example, the House bill does not include authorization of the Ex-Im Bank. Time is the essence, by the way, to get this Ex-Im Bank reauthorized. The bank's temporary extension expires at the end of May and is close to exceeding its operating level of $100 million by the end of this month. Renewing the Ex-Im Bank's charter with increased lending authority is the only way, practically, of countering the predatory financing practices of other trading nations. We spend a lot of time on this floor pointing the finger at companies that are using their sovereign institutions to undermine American jobs, to get them overseas, and yet one of the major institutions in our country that helps American products to be sold overseas is in danger, literally, of going out of business. That's something that will, in fact, enhance job creation. It's not in the House bill. In fact, it's been suggested that Ex-Im Bank activity supports almost 300,000 jobs in the United States each year. It also doesn't include two other programs that result in more jobs, and these two programs are particularly the result of the hard and aggressive and thoughtful work of Senators Landrieu and Snowe. They worked on the extension and expansion of the capacity of the Small Business Administration's Venture Capital Program, the Small Business Investment Company Program, specifically SBIC. They have proposed legislation that would allow another $1 billion equity-like financing for smaller, fast-growing firms, and it also extends for 1 year the SBA's 504 refi loan program to help firms refinance commercial real estate to long-term fixed-rate loans. These modifications have created and saved hundreds of thousands of American jobs at no cost to the taxpayer. These are tried and true ways to increase jobs here in America without running the risk of undermining the information that investors need to make sound choices about where to invest their dollars. Now, it is very tempting to suggest that we simply have to cut a couple of regulations and jobs will expand. That was a theme that was rampant here during the Bush administration. And for a while, frankly, it looked like it was working. But then with the sudden and colossal collapse, we knew that was not the path to long-term sustained job creation. Sound investment based on adequate information in companies that will produce jobs here in the United States is the way to proceed. We need to listen to those individuals charged with the supervision of our capital markets, the SEC, and now we have both the current chairman and a former chairman saying the legislation the House proposed is a threat to all of the investors in this country. The stakes are high if we get some of these things wrong. We've been trying to focus on these issues intensively for the last few months to bring legislation to the floor that will balance capital formation with investor protections. You can't, I think, get one at the expense of the other. You have to have both. So I would encourage all my colleagues to take a very close look at the Reed-Landrieu 11 substitute. I believe it's a substantial improvement of the House bill, and I believe my colleague from Louisiana will speak. And once again, I must commend her passion to protect investors, particularly small investors, and her passion to create jobs through the SBA and other agencies is both remarkable and commendable and indeed exceptional. And with that, Madam President, I will yield the floor.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm going to give the staff just a minute to get set up here for my brief presentation, 10 or 15 minutes, but I want to thank Senator Reed and Senator Levin, who have helped to lead this effort to make a bill that's coming over from the House much better, much safer for investors, as well as generate opportunities for more capital to flow to some of the good and solid ideas that are out there in our marketplace to create jobs. And I am pleased to join these two senators and about a dozen to date and potentially dozens more of our colleagues as people learn the differences, and they are substantial, between the House version of what they call an IPO bill and the Senate version that we have worked on very diligently, carefully over the last 48 hours. The three of us are prepared to vote against the House bill as it stands now. The only hope of getting our support and many others here is to try to amend the House bill, and that's what our efforts are. We're not trying to say no to everything that is in the House bill, because there's some excellent ideas. And even the President himself and the White House and some of the Democrats voted for that bill because there are some good ideas in the bill, and some ideas that have come from some of the brightest entrepreneurs in our country. We're not trying to say no to those ideas. We're trying to say yes to those ideas, but do it in a way that protects investors. Older investors, younger investors, sophisticated investors, and your average sort of non-sophisticated investor, because the Internet has opened up a whole new opportunity. When these security laws were written 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and amended, the Internet wasn't what it is today. And so that is why this crowdfunding bill, which is really in essence a way for the Internet to be used to raise capital, that is illegal generally today. And there are very specific rules about how people can raise capital for their businesses. Some of those regulations are too onerous, some of them are right on, but this whole idea of, oh my goodness, now the Internet is here, look what opportunities could be. We can get our ideas to the marketplace without having to go through middlemen. We have a great idea, a wonderful patent, we want to be able to raise money. We're very excited about this. But there is a right way to do this, and there is a wrong way to do this. The House bill, you know that you're in a little bit of rocky ground when they don't really have the name for it. They've called it everything, from an IPO bill to a jobs bill to a capital expansion bill. What I'm calling it today, and I'll have a poster made over the weekend, is an ill-advised political opportunity bill. An ill-advised political opportunity bill. That's what IPO stands for in my mind. It's ill-advised because the safeguards that are required to make sure that these new ideas happen the way they should are absent from their legislation. That's why when I found out, surprisingly, that the Senate of the United States was getting ready to just take that bill and just adopt it whole hog, I said, absolutely not. We have to slow this down, try to amend it, not kill it, but amend it. And the reason is because there are very respected groups out there that started sending letter after letter after letter to the Senate urging us to do just that. Now, this isn't about a conservative-liberal fight, okay? This is about the right regulations that are necessary before we take a really good idea and mess it up. Okay, crowdfunding is a good idea. It's an exciting idea. There are great entrepreneurs out there. The Internet could be a very powerful tool. But everyone knows that if you enter into new territory without the caution and care, you can really fall off a cliff that you didn't even know was there. Madam President, that is exactly what the House bill is going to do. Now, if you don't want to take my word for it, let's talk about what AARP says about it. This is the first letter. I'm going to put a dozen letters into the record in the next 10 minutes to try to get the attention of the people on the other side of the aisle. This is all an attempt to get their attention over the weekend. And I hope that the press will write about these letters so that when they come back on Monday, they can say, oh my gosh, we have a good bill that came from the House, but there are some real flaws and we should fix it before we create another Wall Street debacle, or before we see people ripped off again like we just went through in the last 6 years. How short is our memory about investors getting stripped, going bankrupt because of exactly the same thing, just not being careful, not having the right rules in place, not having the right enforcements in place. This was like yesterday. That's why when the leadership said we were just going to take up the House bill, I said, wait a minute, no, no, no. This is what the AARP said. Joyce Rogers, I am writing to reiterate our opposition to the lack of investor protections in H.R. 3606. Again, the House passed ill-advised political opportunity bill. That's what I'm calling it. That's what it is. That soon will be considered on the floor of the Senate. AARP's primary concern is this legislation undermines vital investor protections and threatens market integrity. AARP doesn't urge the Senate to kill the bill. AARP urges the Senate to take a more balanced approach, recognizing both an interest in facilitating access to new capital for small business and preserving essential regulations. We believe the amendment to be offered by Senator Reid, Landrieu, and Levin moves closer to achieving that balance. And it goes on to say that sometimes the people that are taken advantage of are the elderly. So wake up, senators from Florida. Wake up, senators from Michigan. Wake up, senators that have big senior populations. The AARP is against the House bill, the ill-advised political opportunity bill. North American Securities Administrators, they sent a letter yesterday. It's 7 pages long. Jack Herstein, they go into great detail on behalf of the North American Securities Administrators Association. I don't think that this is a liberal think tank. I think this is a very well-respected, not left-wing, regulate everything that moves kind of group. I think they said, I'm right, I think that's correct, and they say I'm writing to express concerns regarding several provisions, most notably our strong concern with the extraordinary step of preempting state law for crowdfunding that's contained in the H.R. ill-advised political opportunity bill, which was passed by the House. State security regulators support efforts by Congress to ensure that laws facilitating the raising of capital are modern and efficient, that Americans are encouraged to raise money to invest in the economy. However, it's critical that in doing so, Congress not disregard basic investor protections. I'm going to submit this letter without objection, I hope, to the record. Now, this is the North American Securities Administration. This is the Council of Institutional Investors, nonprofit, nonpartisan association of public, corporate, and union pension plans. Let me repeat, not just union pension plans here, public and corporate pension plans. They are writing with questions about the House ill-advised political opportunity bill and go into great details. So I'm putting this into the record, hoping people will actually read the congressional record. Another letter to Speaker Boehner and Nancy Pelosi. This was delivered to the House. It may be a little different than the one to the Senate, so I'd like to put that into the record.
Without objection.
This letter was received yesterday. These are very important letters received just recently. That's why I'm asking people, wake up, pay attention. Securities and Exchange Commission, March 13th. This is to Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Shelby, basically saying last week the House of Representatives passed H.R. 3606. As the Senate prepares to debate many of the capital formation initiatives, I want to share with you my concern on some important aspects of this significant legislation, and it is signed by Mary Shapiro, Chairman, outlining a dozen of her concerns because, of course, she thinks that there's going to be a debate. She would expect a debate on a bill of this nature and magnitude and diversion from the ordinary. But we weren't going to have a debate. We were just going to be told to take the House bill or leave it until a few of us said, no, slow this train down. There's no way to run a railroad. We're not trying to kill the bill. We're not trying to delay. We're trying to have at least a 2 or 3 day debate on an important piece of legislation that, if it's not done right, is going to absolutely ruin the best chance we've had in decades to actually get capital into the hands of businesses. Everyone here should now know me well enough as the chair of the Small Business Committee to know that I have spent literally nights, days, and weekends on the floor of this Senate trying to figure out ways to get capital into the hands of small business. Why would I stand here and try to stop that? I've spent my whole time as the Senate chairman of the Small Business Committee trying to do that. But again, there's a right way to do that and a wrong way. And Madam President, if we take the wrong path and fall off of a cliff, we're going to ruin the chance that we have with this new internet tool, this very exciting opportunity, and we are going to ruin our chances to get this done. And who's going to suffer? The same people that suffer all the time, the small businesses and the exciting startup opportunities and entrepreneurs that need our help. Any bill that's a major bill can stand the scrutiny of time for the public and an amendment. And if it can't stand that scrutiny, then I'd suggest there's something terribly flawed with it. And that's what we're trying to provide, scrutiny. This comes from the AFL-CIO, from Jeff Hauser, an email. Yes, America needs jobs, yet Congress cannot enact such basic legislation as reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Bill, which we passed, but it hasn't been. He goes on to say, workers' retirement savings will be at risk if the House bill is passed. Once again, our economy will be at risk of the folly of policymakers promoting financial bubbles, ignoring the needs of the real economy. The AFL-CIO calls on Congress to set aside politics of the 1%, the old games favoring Wall Street. And they're very strong in their language and probably a lot stronger than these organizations, but I think they have reason to be. Many of their members were taken to the cleaners by scams on Wall Street. They've yet to recover. Their 401s have yet to recover. And even yesterday or last week in the paper, I saw one of the big companies that failed. I think it was MF Global. Did you all see that in the newspaper? They failed, of course, and it was a terrible debacle. Lots of people lost money, but the CEO is walking away with a $7 million bonus. People that work hard all day have a very hard time understanding how we in the Congress can allow the CEO to walk away with a bonus of $7 million when he bankrupted thousands of people. That's a good question. Are we going to do that again with this House bill? I hope not. So let's put the AFL on record saying, slow down.
Action.
This is the next message I want to put in from the Secretaries of State, and I want to read off which secretaries they are. The Secretary from Missouri, Robin Carnahan. The Secretary from Massachusetts, William Gavin. the Secretary from New Hampshire, William Gardner, the Secretary from Mississippi, I believe is a Republican, Delbert Hosemann, the Secretary from North Carolina, Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall, the Secretary from Nevada, Ross Miller, the Secretary of State from Indiana, Charles White, and the Secretary of State from Illinois, Jesse White says the same thing. Beware of the House bill. It is flawed. It has some good ideas in it, but those flaws need to be corrected. That's what the Reid, Landrieu, Levin, et al. Does. We aren't trying to kill these wonderful ideas, exciting ideas. We're trying to fix it so it's better. And I hope that our members on the other side will join us in doing that, and I'd like to submit this to the record.
Without objection.
The last I'm sorry, there are two more. Well, actually, I'm sorry, four more. We've gotten so many. The next one is from my Office of Financial Institutions from Baton Rouge. My commissioner, banking commissioner, wrote me. He is generally in favor of some of the things in the House bill, but he said, I'm writing to urge you to oppose the preemption of Louisiana law to protect investors. That I'd like to put into the record.
Without objection.
The American Sustainability Business Council, signed by David Levine. Again, I don't believe that this is a left-leaning group. I think it's a pretty centrist organization. They urge us to take a hard look at the House bill. And finally, Madam President, I want to put into the record, this is really when I got nervous, when I started receiving letters in my office from crowdfunders themselves against the House bill. The people who gave the idea to start up crowdfunding have now said the House bill is flawed. And what they say here is, we write in favor of the bipartisan Compromise Crowdfund Act proposed recently by Merkley, Brown, Bennett, and Landrieu. That's the crowdfunding act that's in this substitute. Yesterday evening's introduction, this was last week, of the first bipartisan Senate crowdfunding bill is a big step forward in our fight to get equity crowdfunding passed through Congress. I've been to Washington, D.C. 7 times since mid-November discussing this legislation. The offices of the senators on the Banking Committee have been very receptive to input from the entrepreneurial community and have adopted many of our suggestions. But they go on to say, while the opposition is mainly, it goes on to say, the latest bill is important because unlike previous bills, for the first time we have a Senate bill with bipartisan sponsorship, a balance of state oversight and federal uniformity, industrial standard investor protections, and workable funding caps. This bill has a legitimate chance at quieting those who were previously trumping up fears of fraud and bad actors. To date, the main issues the opposition raised regarding fraud and state oversight. So what they're saying is, we're the ones that helped invent this concept. We don't think the House bill is where it should be. We're supporting the Merkley-Bennett approach, which is in this bill. So launch it, we hear you, and we're trying to respond. And finally, Motavi, I guess is the way, again, a crowdfunder advocate, people very entrepreneurial, coming up with these ideas, saying the same thing. Could I have those into the record?
Without objection.
Okay, so again, just to recap, so people can see on this chart. AARP has written us against the House bill. Consumer Federation of America against the House bill. The AFL-CIO against the House bill. Yes, those are some of the left-leaning organizations. But we also have centrist, and right-leaning organizations talking about the former Security and Exchange Commissioner's chief accountant. This is what they say. There are always paths to improvement for a complex system, the American Stock Exchange included. But how quickly these congressmen seem to have forgotten why many such regulations were enacted in the first place. Last month marked the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Enron. Madam President, it hasn't been 10 years, and we're going back to where we were when Enron took money out of the pockets of thousands of people in America. Why are we doing that? Regulations that prevent capital multiplying companies that want to go public from doing so are bad. Ones that prevent capital destroying ones from becoming public nuisances are good. No job creation will be generated through the process of socializing capital destruction to the general public. But he's saying that the House bill goes too far. And again, Eric Schulenberg, editor of Inc.com. Inc.com, they are a very well-respected voice in the small business community in America today. They are saying that the House bill is flawed. So I know that we're going to be criticized on the other side by saying it's just the same old left-wing groups that want more regulation and more regulation, but that is not true. And that is why I'm putting all of this in the record today, so that people can carefully consider tomorrow and over the weekend and on Monday before we come back here to look and read what is being said about the House bill, and to be open and honest in our efforts to try to reform it. Again, just others for the record, Mary Shapiro, chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. While I recognize that H.R. 3606, the ill-advised political opportunity bill, those are my words, is the product of bipartisan effort designed to facilitate capital formation and includes certain promising approaches, I believe there are provisions that should be added or modified to improve investor protections that are worthy of the Senate's consideration. And so that's what we have done. We took the bill from the House and looked at it very carefully. And on Monday, I'm going to hand this out to everyone, and we're sending it to everyone's offices now. It's kind of become a famous small business blue line that's very easy for everyone to understand, and it shows the differences between the Senate bill and the House bill. And as you can see, both bills raise the cap on Regulation A offerings from $5 million to $50 million. We're happy to do that. But we improve the transparency of Regulation A by requiring an audited financial statement. Madam President, you don't need to have graduated from a master's program at Stanford or Harvard to understand that if you're getting ready to invest, whether it's $1,000 or $10,000 or $100,000, having an audited financial statement about the company you're getting ready to invest in would be kind of a basic thing to do. I think that maybe we learn about this when we're in maybe 7th or 8th grade. You don't have to go to Harvard to know this. The audited financial statement, however, requirement is absent from the House bill. There is no requirement in the House bill for an audited financial statement, so we just put an audited financial statement in our bill. I don't think that's a radical amendment. It's a simple one. It's an important one. We also, you've heard about this IPO on-ramp. And in the House bill, they exempt companies up to $1 billion in annual revenue. Now, $1 billion is a lot of money, so everybody wake up. The House bill says if you are less than $1 billion, that you basically don't have to adhere to most of the rules and regulations. You can just go on your merry way. Now, how many, that's great, ill-advised political opportunity. That's what I'm calling the House bill. But let me just check to see how many companies went public that were over $1 billion last year. Do we know? Only 22% of companies went public last year, over $1 billion. So if my math's correct, the House bill is going to eliminate from regulation 88%, 78%, that's why I need to check, 78% of the companies from regulation that raise money in the public. Now, that is going too far. It is unnecessary. We bring that number down in our bill to $350, and the author of this provision in the Senate has signed on as a supporter, Chuck Schumer. And the reason he did is because he realizes, even as the sponsor of this on-ramp provision, that the House bill went too far. I'm not going to go into all of the rules and regulations, but it's not that complicated because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are only really about 8 big differences, but they're important differences. And so I'm going to wrap up here by saying, please study the record, please look at it, and in our Senate bill, which, Madam President, you've been very supportive of, as has Senator Cantwell, and I want to thank both of you publicly, as well as Senator Klobuchar, we have the Export-Import Bank in our bill, which is not in the House bill. And the Chamber of Commerce has written us, asking us to please support the Export-Import Bank. We also expand the SBIC, which is the Small Business Investment Program, which the President included in his State of the Union address to authorize that program to move from $3 billion to $4 billion. Why? Because we're having such success through the SBIC programs that exist in all of our states, getting money out to Main Street to small businesses. So that is included in our bill. And one that you've been particularly a lead on, that is no cost to the taxpayer. These things do not cost any additional money. The SBA 504 refinancing that's going to extend for 1 year, the ability of the Small Business Loan Program that has thousands of outstanding loans to extend for another year, the opportunity them to refinance their commercial loans. So we've added 3 provisions to the House bill that makes it more balanced and better for small business, and we've put in a couple of oversight measures into their provisions that I think, in the words of many of even the advocates of this bill, make the bill better. I don't know, Madam President, if we'll be successful, but this is worth a try, because the damage that could be done in venturing out so far into a new way of financing without the proper safeguards could set us back decades. We don't want to go backwards, Madam President. We want to go forward. We don't want to go back to the days of Enron and Bernie Madoff. We don't want to go back. We want to go forward. Why would Republicans, in the face of these scandals, come up with, and some Democrats voted for it, I'm not quite sure how that happened, but we're going to find out. Why would they want to go back to those days? We want to go forward with the right protections. I see my friend Senator Levin on the floor. He most certainly understands this issue better in many ways than I do on the technical side of it. He's helped write this bill. I'm hoping that he will give even a better explanation than I've been able to give, but I think I've covered it pretty broadly, and he can go into a lot more detail about the possibility of fraud in here if it's not locked down. And I'm going to end with just a word to my community banks, because I have tried to become a champion for them. I think that they can appreciate it. I'm not 100% sure. I really believe in community banks. The Independent Community Bankers of America sent a letter supporting the House bill. I'm going to call them over the weekend and talk with them specifically about my concerns and ask them to reconsider their position. Our compromise, I think, is very good for our community bankers. I don't know whether they will or not. I know that they want to get rid of some of the onerous requirements that were placed on them in the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, and I appreciate it. I helped sponsor some of the amendments on their behalf. But I think this House bill is going too far. I'm going to reach out to them. We will see what their view is. I do respect the views of my community bankers. But let me yield the floor now. We're going to have a lot more to talk about next week. And I again thank Senator Levin and Senator Reid for joining with me, and for Senator Reid leading this effort, Jack Reid, to help put a bill before the Senate that really is quite balanced, that provides the investor protections and also opens up some exciting opportunities for capital to create new businesses in America that are the backbone of our extraordinary and not to be matched really entrepreneurship spirit in the world. We honor that, but we want to do it in the right way. And I yield the floor.
The Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, before the Senator from Louisiana leaves the floor, let me just thank her for her leadership in this area, the passion that she has brought to it. This is a train which has moved with great speed from the House of Representatives, much too great speed, and her ability, just by the expression of her will and her determination to bring this to a point where we can debate it at least over a few days and a weekend is critically important, I believe, to the future of investors in this country. There's no state that has suffered more from the job losses of the Great Recession than my state of Michigan, Madam President. And you don't have to ask a Michiganian twice if he or she believes that Congress should take action to increase the speed of the jobs recovery. So I'm ready to consider any legislation that promises more opportunity for the workers of this country. But unfortunately, the legislation that the House has sent to us, which is promoted as a job creation bill, is no such thing. In the name of job creation, the House bill would severely weaken investor and taxpayer protections in our securities laws. In the name of putting Americans to work, the House bill would hand a series of special favors to influential special interest groups. It also reflects a disturbing failure to learn the lessons of the recent and all too painful past. It defies belief, Madam President, that after the worst financial crisis in generations, a crisis brought on by the failure to effectively police our financial markets, that Congress would consider removing vital obstacles to fraud and abuse. The House bill would take a series of steps that would undermine the integrity of our financial markets. We should not go down that road. We need not go down that road. And working with Senators Jack Reid, Senator Landrieu, Senator Sherrod Brown, and others, I've participated in an effort to make some changes in that bill that would give small, innovative companies more tools to access the capital that they need. We want to do that. We all want to do that. But we do that in our bill without putting the stability of our economy and the interests of American investors and taxpayers at risk. And I want to just lay out some of the problems with the House bill and how our Reid-Landrieu-Levin amendment would address those problems. The House bill would lower barriers to fraud that are now present in the so-called Regulation A stock offerings. These are offerings that are exempt from the SEC registration requirements. The House bill would expose retail investors, those with no expertise, no resources to assess the risks of participating in the unregulated market, to massive potential fraud and abuse. The bill does not even require that companies making offerings under Regulation A provide audited financial statements. The Regulation A process is appropriate for very small companies, but the House bill provides few meaningful limits to its use. Instead, it would allow larger companies to avoid meaningful oversight year after year. Now, I've worked with colleagues to fix this problem by ensuring that these offerings are limited so that they're only used once every 3 years. That's one of the changes we would make. That investors in the offerings get an accurate picture of the company's finances by requiring audited financial statements. In the name of giving smaller companies greater access to the initial public offering market, the House bill would create a new class of corporation called an emerging growth company and would strip from investors in such companies more than a dozen important investor protections. Some of the protections involve transparency. The House bill would weaken corporate governance provisions that we enacted less than 2 years ago in the Dodd-Frank Act, including disclosures on executive pay. The House bill would exempt these companies from having to comply with changes to accounting standards. It would repeal the protections that we put in place after the dot-com bubble burst. These protections require financial firms to separate research analysts who advise clients on whether to invest in initial public offerings from the sales teams of those same companies. There's supposed to be a wall between those two parts of any company so that the sales teams don't take advantage of what the research teams are telling their customers. There's too many opportunities for conflicts of interest and front-running and other things if you allow that wall to be breached. The House bill provides that companies with up to $1 billion in annual revenues would not have to get an outside auditor to check their internal controls. So what happens if one of these companies is cooking the books? Who's going to catch it? We learned with Enron and WorldCom why we need meaningful checks on how companies prepare their financial statements. The vast majority of financial restatements, which are corrections to bad information given to the investing public, are made by medium and small companies. Investors in these companies should have the confidence that the financial statements on which they base their decisions are accurate. Now, those provisions of the House bill are bad enough, given the chronic problem in financial markets with poor and misleading financial disclosure. But to make matters worse, the bill would open this collection of loopholes to companies with up to $1 billion in annual revenues. Now, that is a level which would include well over 80% of all IPOs. So over 80% of all the IPOs which will be issued would then be exempt from the protections under the House bill. Financial regulators, Association of Individual Investors, many of the largest pension funds in this country, securities experts, and the Chamber of Commerce have all raised alarm bells about that $1 billion threshold, as well as the many problems that would follow from the House bill. Just this week, the SEC took a series of enforcement actions against fraudsters seeking to victimize investors in pre-IPO offerings. As one SEC official noted, quote, "The newly emerging secondary market for pre-IPO stock presents risk for even savvy investors," close quote. The House bill threatens to bring the same level of risk and instability that plagues pre-IPO trading to the IPO market itself, changes that rather than building support for IPOs might actually make the IPO market so risky that it ends up dampening investor interest. The amendment that some of us have been working on, which is the Reed, Landrieu, Levin et al. Amendment, accepts the premise that some small, newly public companies could benefit from somewhat relaxed requirements as they adjust to the public marketplace. But our amendment would limit these benefits to smaller companies, those with under $350 million in annual revenues, and our amendment would not exempt these companies from many of the critical investor protections. For example, we would not remove protections designed to protect the integrity of the research that's available to investors, nor would we exempt them from any new accounting rules, nor would we exempt them from requirements regarding important executive pay disclosures and shareholder input on executive pay packages. Our amendment would provide flexibility for smaller, newly public companies to adjust to the public markets, but we would leave in place the investor protections that ensure our public markets remain the best in the world. Now, the House bill would also allow companies or fraudsters posing as legitimate companies to solicit investors directly through the Internet. And this is one of the really big issues that we're going to address next week. As written, the House bill would offer investors almost no protection from fraudulent schemes and fake investment opportunities. Although these websites, they're often called intermediaries or funding portals, are the only entities capable of making sure that a company seeking to sell its stock on its site is real, the House exempts them, exempts the intermediaries and the funding portals from any real regulation or liability. And the same is true with the issuing company. And that's why labor groups, seniors organizations, regulators, and security experts all warn us that this measure is an open invitation to fraud. One group calls it the Boiler Room Legalization Act. So we have many problems with these provisions of the House bill, but we also believe that the so-called crowdfunding, in which small startups can access pools of capital from small investors, usually over the Internet, has the potential to provide opportunity for truly small businesses to get additional capital that they need to grow. This can be done legitimately, and that's why we build on the work of Senators Merkley and Bennett to create a platform for raising money through the Internet. But we make sure, as they do, that it has the necessary investor and consumer protections. In fact, legitimate crowdfunding sites have made it clear to us that they, like us, are concerned about the House bill. So we have legitimate crowdfunding interest groups that want to make sure that the protections are there for the investors, speaking out against some of the excessive provisions in the House bill. They want the additional protections that we provide. So our amendment makes sure that funding portals are subject to meaningful regulation and that the companies that use them to raise capital are also subject to meaningful regulation. Our amendment would, unlike the House bill, require comprehensive disclosures to investors about the company and the risks of such investments. If this new way of investing in small companies is to succeed, then investor protections, like the ones embodied in the Merkley-Bennett provisions, which we've included in our amendment, are vital to giving investors the confidence to participate. The House bill also attempts to remove regulations on so-called private offerings. By allowing issuers of private offerings to market their stock to the general public, whether it's on billboards or the Internet or wherever, in visits to retirement homes or late-night television ads, that provision in the House bill would dangerously lower our defenses against frauds. We have seen this movie before, Madam President. In the 1990s, regulators lowered the barriers to general solicitation for private offerings, and within years reversed their error because of widespread fraud and abuse. Some have complained that the existing restrictions on solicitation for private offerings are too narrow and impede businesses' access to capital. That seems unlikely given the nearly $1 trillion a year in private offering activity. But if there are yet more worthy investments that are going unfunded because of unneeded investor protections, the SEC regulations should be updated for the Internet age. The Reed-Landrieu-Levin amendment would direct the SEC to revise its rules to allow companies to offer and sell shares to accredited investors. But it then directs the SEC to make sure that those who offer or sell these securities take reasonable steps to verify that the purchasers are actually accredited investors. It requires the SEC to revise its rules to make sure that these sales tactics are appropriate. There's not going to be, under our language, billboards, or cold calls to senior living centers. I wish I could say the same about the House bill. Madam President, there is little evidence that the reduced investor protections and invitations to fraud in the House bill will make any meaningful contribution to job growth. We do not have one study on any one of the provisions in the House bill establishing that even one job will be created. If such a study existed, I'm sure we would have seen it. The simple reality is that repealing federal securities laws, and that is clearly the intent of the House bill, does not create jobs. In fact, a former chief accountant of the SEC was quoted recently as saying this jobs bill was no jobs bill at all. He said, quote, "This would be better known as the Bucket Shop and Penny Stock Fraud Reauthorization Act of 2012. Taken together, these and other provisions in the House bill send a false message that in order to grow the economy, we must subject our citizens to more fraud, we must put pension funds and church endowments at greater risk of fleecing, we must create more threats to the financial stability of American families. The America that I know and I believe in is capable of growing our economy without these unnecessary risks. Indeed, it is fraud and financial abuse that have repeatedly brought our economy to its knees. We opened the door to fraud and abuse in the savings and loan industry. We precipitated a crisis that destroyed 750 financial institutions when we did that. We cut the number of new homes built in this country by nearly half and devastated entire communities. We dropped the barriers to fraud through financial statements and in swaps markets, opening the door to the predations of the so-called, quote, smartest guys in the room. Those are the criminal executives of Enron. We lowered the barriers to heedless risk and conflicts of interest in the financial system, and we paved the road thereby to the greatest financial crisis since the 1930s. Over the last 10 years, on a bipartisan basis, my permanent subcommittee on investigations has held hearing after hearing and issued report after report on the Enron crisis, on accounting and securities frauds, and the more recent subprime mortgage crisis. Our investigation has exposed how some American corporations, their accountants, and banks were willing to dupe investors and even after their wrongdoing came to light, walk away with huge paychecks, while workers, investors, and the American economy at large paid the price. Enron was the 7th largest U.S. corporation before its crash bankrupted employees, pensions, and investors. It lied about its earnings and did so with the help of accountants and banks. Goldman Sachs sold securities through public and private offerings that did not fully inform investors about what they were buying. The wrongdoing that our subcommittee has uncovered over the years is as powerful a reminder as you can get that investors deserve protection against abuses when they invest their hard-earned dollars in U.S. capital markets. There's a rising wave of concern among market experts that the House legislation's effect might be precisely the opposite of its supporters' stated intent, and that instead of boosting the ability of companies to find capital so that they can grow, that these changes would hurt the market for investing in new companies by making that market too risky. If we remove meaningful transparency and safeguards against fraud, SEC Chairman Shapiro wrote just a few days ago, quote, investors will lose confidence in our markets and capital formation will ultimately be made more difficult and expensive. The question for the champions of lower regulatory barriers is this: did those rollbacks of regulatory protections help our economy grow? Did those rollbacks, which we saw so many of and which I've just outlined, create jobs? Ask a family that was wiped out in a financial crisis. Ask an investor who lost everything to Enron. Ask one of the 8.6 million American workers who lost their jobs in a financial crisis created on Wall Street, one that we have yet to fully overcome. In November of 1999, this body debated another piece of financial legislation, one whose supporters claim would lead to boundless new economic opportunities for our country. The bill that we were debating repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. It lowered barriers to concentration in the financial industry. It removed the wall that had separated investment banking from commercial banking since the aftermath of the Great Depression. Senator Byron Dorgan came to this floor, and he issued a warning. Quote, "It may be that I'm hopelessly old-fashioned," he said, "but I just do not think we should ignore the lessons learned in the 1930s. I also think that we will," he said, "in 10 years' time, look back and say we should not have done that because we forgot the lessons of the past." Well, that was 1999. 10 years after Senator Dorgan's remarks, almost to the day that he predicted, America's economy hit rock bottom with the lowest mark of employment during the Great Recession. Well, old-fashioned sounds pretty good these days. I hope to be as old-fashioned as Senator Dorgan, who warned us that lowering the barriers that protect us from financial catastrophe can only destroy jobs, not create jobs, destroy jobs. I hope the Senate will turn away from the House bill that threatens more fraud, more abuse, and renewed crisis. I hope the Senate will embrace reforms that are present in our substitute amendment that give our innovative companies the chance to compete without endangering investor confidence or the stability of our economy. And, Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.